And now we can welcome Bart Kranstauber, who is from the University of Amsterdam. And as we promised to you, we will be also explaining the ecological perspective of the whole challenge. So please welcome Bart.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you. Today I want to discuss the relevance of understanding, mapping and predicting bird movements for wind energy. So a little bit taking the different perspective from the previous speaker. And I often like to start out showing this animation and also showing you a little bit my interest. In this animation, you see the trajectory of individually followed birds all combined into 1 year. The dates here on the top. And what you see is that all these birds are moving across the globe. And you see that as the snow melts in the northern hemisphere, a lot of birds start to move north to find better breeding opportunities where a lot of food becomes available. And this is very much what interests me, to understand where and when animals move. How do they select advantageous environments? Where do they move to? Where do they move away from? And not only out of a fundamental ecological interest, but also this helps us to understand how and when we can protect birds. And my tools are often to use data that's available and models to analyze these kind of data. So, however, birds are not alone in the airspace anymore. As you have seen in the previous talk, and I'll highlight once more, we see that there's a lot of wind farms being built. You see in the last 3 decades here how over time the installed capacity of wind energy in the Netherlands is exploding. And this will be increasing only much more. I think in the next decade, the capacity offshore is supposed to quadruple. So meaning we'll have a lot more wind energy and wind turbines in the airspace. And this is, of course, a good thing for a lot of ecological processes and biodiversity, as it helps us to prevent CO2 emissions and battle climate change. However, as these birds now start to share the airspace, there's also a risk. Birds can get hit by the wind turbine blades. These turbines are spinning. Their rotation speed is not so quick, but actually if you start to think, these blades move at very high speeds. I think the tip of a blade can reach speeds like 90 meters per second to 300 kilometers per hour, meaning that if a bird is there and it gets hit, it's pretty much instantly killed. And each turbine on land, and this is very rough numbers, we don't know very exactly, kills about 10 to 100 birds. And even also maybe a dozen bats a year. So per turbine, that's maybe not tremendous numbers given the amount of birds and bats we have. However, if you start to realize that the Netherlands now already has 3,000 turbines, and this is only going to increase, the numbers start to add up. And therefore, it's important to identify where and when birds are at risk from these wind turbines, so that we can conduct this energy transition in a way that's sustainable and not endangering wildlife. So, to tell you a little bit more about birds and bird migration and other movements of animals, it's good to realize that 1 billion birds migrate through Europe. And a lot of this migration actually is at night. So here, if you look, even though the number of species are roughly equal that migrate during the day or during the night, the species that migrate during the night are with much larger numbers. And actually, this migration is also concentrated in a few nights. Here you see the abundance of migratory birds over time. Each vertical line is a night. And we see that in a few nights, most of the migratory birds pass. If you do the math in the Netherlands, I think it's in a migration season, so fall or spring, about 50% of the birds pass in 12 to 16 nights. So in a relatively short time, a lot of birds pass. And now offshore, this is even more dramatic. We found that on the North Sea, half of the migratory passage happens in 18 to 26 hours. So how does this migration then look like? And here we've visualized the abundance of migratory birds in the air. Red means that there's a lot more bird migrating during one night. Here you see the time. And what you see is that as the sun sets, once migration starts throughout the whole of the Netherlands, and sometimes you see these migratory waves come through. There's areas where there's high densities of birds, like here in Zeeland. So we kind of get an idea of how migration looks like, but how can we actually study this? And at the University of Amsterdam, we have a group that actually starts to use radars to study bird movement. And radars basically monitor any activity in the sky. They were developed, I think, in the Second World War to monitor airplanes, fighters coming from Germany to the UK. However, nowadays they're used to monitor planes, they're used to monitor weather, but also other things moving in the sky, like birds, bats, and insects, can be seen. And us as ecologists, radars provide a lot of advantages. They continuously operate. We get measurements of what's happening in the airspace all the time. They also work at night. We're not dependent on binoculars to actually see what's happening during the night. Rather, they just work, and they measure with the same consistency day and night. And they also monitor all activity. So what we often also do is equip birds with a GPS. However, this GPS only gives us information of few individuals, how many average GPSs we were able to buy and equip, and often this only works on birds that were relatively heavy. We also don't know what happens to the birds we were not able to capture. So therefore, radars provide us, especially in the context of wind energy, with a lot of useful information and can give us a clear picture of what's happening around locations of interest. And we use these at different scales. Sometimes we're interested in what happens over the whole of the Netherlands, like I've shown you in the animation before. And we use the weather radars from the KNMI. These are the same radars that are used for your rain app, buienradar. However, where they filter out the birds, we filter out the rain in order to make these visualizations. And these gives us a picture of what's happening on the large scale throughout the Netherlands, what are maybe interesting areas, what are less interesting areas. We also look at a finer scale with bird radars, what happens around wind parks. And I'll go through some of these examples to show you what happens at these different scales and how we use the radars. So first of all, using these weather radars at this very large scale. I've shown you the animation before that was based on the Dutch weather radars. And what we have done, for example, is actually taking a lot of nights with this high abundance of migration and combining the density maps for all these nights. And in this way, we can get a map of the average migration density over the Netherlands. And this can help us in several ways to protect birds. And what you directly see is that there's areas with that in spring there's a lower density of migratory birds compared to autumn, where there's much more birds. And this relates to weather patterns, and that in autumn also a lot more juveniles join the migration. What we also see that there's actually quite a bit of differences. There's areas with higher densities, there's areas with lower densities, and this is actually something that was not very clear before. People tended to think of migration as a large, broad process, but rather there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity. And then we can then start to think about how we can use this for wind energy. And this is an example where we took the North Holland, and there's several sites they were interested for developing wind farms. And for all these sites, we can calculate what is the average migration density. And what you see is that between these sites, in spring, the migration density is on average quite low, but in fall, there's a huge difference between these different sites. And depending on which site you would select for your wind farm, you would affect twice as many birds compared to the other site. So that means that if you can site your location smartly, you can already avoid a lot of impact. Similarly, you can also imagine if you want to take measures, for example, stopping wind turbines, you would have a much larger impact if you stop it in an area where a lot of birds pass compared to other areas where fewer birds pass. And then if you want to stop a turbine, you need to know what is the bird passage and when is it happening. You don't want to stop it all the nights in fall, but rather only focus on the nights when a lot of birds are passing. And that's where we need to start predicting migration. And we have also worked on these models where we took these weather radars, measured the bird density over the whole, over a large space, a whole continent actually, and started to predict bird migration. And these predictive models can be used for temporal shutdowns of wind turbines. So what we did is developed a neural network, a process-guided deep learning model, where we divided the space in all kinds of cells, and then we start moving the model, modeling the movement of these birds over these cells. So what we have done, and this was together with the AI for Science Institute in Amsterdam, is take past bird observations, weather observations, as the birds respond to the weather conditions and like to fly with advantageous wind conditions, and then use this in order to start making predictions into the future about the bird migration. And what we see is that we can make quite good predictions on a continental scale. So here we have applied this model to data from the United States, where a lot of weather radar data is available. And then we've predicted 3 days ahead. So there's 3 days, and for all these 3 days, we have checked how the predictions actually match with the radar. And there's 3 different radars here, and what we see is that the predictions, here shown as the yellow line, actually correspond quite well with the observations as shown in the black line. So we can actually make this useful prediction, start to understand ecology, start to see where birds depart from and where they move to. And what you also here see is that you clearly get these migratory waves, and in different parts of the country, migration happens at different times. In some nights, there's a lot of things happening here. In the, Midwest? Well, on other nights, much less is happening. However, these predictions are still at a very large scale. They're at a continental scale. And we have also been working in the Netherlands at a much more local scale. So there we were making predictions on the North Sea. And this is with bird radars that were installed on wind farms in the North Sea. And we have made predictive models to predict the bird migration at these sites. This is work by Maya Braderich. And in these models, we predict the hourly passage rates of birds. So what we've done, we've taken these radar data, processed it to an hourly passage rates, and started to develop a model where we use the weather as an input, so both the local weather conditions, as well as the weather conditions in the areas where we think the birds come through, and seasonal patterns like timing in the day and timing in the season. And what we find is that we can actually predict what nights are likely to be good relatively well, and that wind and timing are one of the key predictors. However, what is much more challenging is actually to predict the magnitude of these peaks. We don't always very well able to find out to what magnitude there's a bird migration peak. We know there's a lot of birds migrating, we just don't know how many exactly. And what we find is that under ideal circumstances, we would only need to shut down turbines for 18 hours to give half of the birds a safe migratory passage. However, given the inaccuracies in predictions, the number of hours that we would actually need to give half of the birds a safe migratory passage would roughly double. This is an example from 1 year, but we have it for multiple years. And this model is now actually also used in practice. It's called the start-stop procedure, and the Netherlands is one of the first countries doing it this way, where the model makes a prediction about 2 days ahead about the migratory passage of birds, and then TenneT starts to look whether they can shut down the turbines, if they can arrange alternative power sources. But it is also quite tricky. You can imagine that predicting 2 days ahead doesn't make the model more accurate, that the impact on the power grid is huge, because there's a lot of offshore capacity, and that in the end for the birds it's also not necessarily ideal if too often alternative power sources need to be used, as will emit a lot of CO2. So that kind of leads us to that we need more targeted approaches. And probably shouldn't revert to these large curtailments too often. Maybe if there's a lot of migration, it's a good idea, but if you can make it more targeted, that's the better. So we see that these large-scale measures can actually be limiting to the energy transition. It just makes wind power more expensive, and we would rather have location-specific, where you maybe need to shut down less turbines and can get a more targeted approach through which the impact on the power grid would be less. And you could also think about taking into account which bird species are most vulnerable. For example, in the Veluwe, there's the honey buzzard, and there a lot of wind turbine development is mostly stopped due to or hindered by the honey buzzard being at risk there. So if you can take into account which species of concern are most at risk at which locations, you can make your approaches more targeted. And that's where it's very important to be able to actually identify the correct species. And for us as biologists, it's quite natural. A lot of species differ a lot. Some species live more in the forest, other in the open landscape. And this also means that all these species have different risks of being hit by a wind turbine. If you live in a forest and most wind turbines are placed in fields, you're less likely to be hit by a wind turbine. Also, birds behave differently. Some fly close to the surface, and maybe if you fly at 10 meters, you will hardly ever get into the rotor zone where you could be hit by a wind turbine, while others fly at higher altitudes. Also, there's a huge difference in flight behavior. where storks can use thermals to soar up and make a circling motion. Other birds fly more directed. All these things you need to take into account and affect the risk of birds being hit by a wind turbine. There's also differences in avoidance behavior. There's even sometimes relatively closely related species. This is a graph I got from the Gouden Kiekendief project. And this is the marsh harrier and the Montagu's harrier. They're relatively closely related harrier species. And what they've done is plotted the locations of GPS points, so points where they were tracked, relative to wind turbines. And here the wind turbine is located in the middle, and the rotor diameter is this red circle around it. And what you see is that under the rotor, so below the rotor diameter, these birds used all the space under these turbines, and they kind of move all around, somewhat seeming to ignore the turbine. However, if you look into the rotor height of the rotor diameter, so at the height where the wind turbine blades are spinning, this Montagu's harrier seems to be quite effective in actually avoiding this zone, and thus have a reduced risk of being hit by a wind turbine, while the marsh harrier enters this rotor zone much more often, meaning it's much more likely to be hit by the rotors. So that's on the risk. Species have different risks, experience different risk from these wind turbines. And there's also the impact. For some species, a few individuals hit by a wind turbine might be much more consequential for the population of these birds than for other species. So here I've plotted two species that I think will also occur in the challenge. And that's, for example, the western marsh harrier, where we have a limited set. We have less than 1,000 breeding pairs in the Netherlands, and they produce 3 to 6 eggs per year. And the population in winter is also not so big. So you can imagine, if a few of those individuals die, it could have quite a big consequence for the population. Well, if you think about the grey-legged goose, they have a much larger breeding population. They produce more eggs, so they're probably also more easily recover from the extra casualties. So this is important to take into account what species are more resilient to the extra pressure on the population from wind turbines. Another extreme example are bats. Bats are extremely long-lived. They live for 20 years. They produce 1, maybe 2 young a year per bat. And therefore, if you lose a few bats, this can have a huge consequence for the bat population. This also means that some of these mistakes in classifying might be more crucial than others. So in today's presentation, I hope I made clear to you how we use radars to study the impact of turbines on birds, and that we also need more targeted approaches where we can not do these large-scale curtailments, but rather find out where and when the actual conflicts occur and with which species. And that identifying species is very important for the research we're doing, and actually also to find out what are the right mitigation measures and when we want to take these mitigation measures. Then, if you're still interested in this topic about ecology and radars, and see how we can use computational models to do this, and if you want to learn more, there is this summer the International Radar Aeroecology Conference in Amsterdam, and you can always contact me to discuss ideas for projects. Thank you very much. And before finishing up, I want to thank all the people that have contributed and all the PhD students that have contributed their work, like Fiona, who did the large-scale model, Bart, Hoekstra, and Maya. Thank you very much for your time and attention.